you had been telling me in some of the stuff you were looking at around some of the other Baltic nations about the issues of, if you're a kind of ethnic minority in one of these countries, and the borders keep changing and different people are in power, do a lot of kind of ethnic Finns end up in the gulag? Is that kind of happening, or is it not so much? Because that obviously happens in some of the other Baltic states further down, but you can tell me maybe a little bit about what have you come across on that front.
I mean, from what I've seen, I don't think that happened on anywhere near the same scale or degree as with other countries.
Well, maybe did the Russians maybe see them as more ethnically Russian because of the proximity?
Not necessarily, because Finland. I mean, the easiest way to kind of illustrate this is that you look at, say, like we talk about Scandinavia, right? We look at Scandinavian countries, so you always think of Sweden, Norway, Denmark, even as well. Finland is included within that. But culturally, Finland, in terms of language, in terms of like their actual culture, they're way different. It's the same with the Baltic states. You have obviously maybe some cultural similarities between Lithuania and Latvia, but then Estonia is more close to Finland than the other two. And again, that's where we go back to this kind of notion that Greater Finland that they were looking to establish, where they would have kind of their ethnic group would have that kind of region in all the regions that they lived in as one big country. So I guess that's kind of the context of that. I mean, interesting is another interesting point was that there was actually a little civil war in Finland following the independence declaration, again between whites and reds, and obviously like the more democratic faction against the communist faction.
So very much mirroring the Russian civil war in that regard.
And the Bolsheviks supported obviously the communist sort of faction, which eventually lost because some of the white Russian forces tried to help the white side of the Finns, which were eventually triumphant. But then the red Finns, who then went into Russia, were eventually, I think, executed by the Bolsheviks, which then caused even more bad blood between the Finns and the Russians, because even there was sort of like, we didn't like those guys, but you didn't need to kill them because they were from Finland. Like, that's a bit
also, they're kind of coming to you saying, brothers, comrades, we're all of the same thing, and they go, no, you're not.
Pretty much. It's kind of like, you're useless. You haven't served your purpose here, so that's that. So there's interesting kind of nuances in that part as well. So I mean, that's kind of a brief history of that. But to take it back to the current day, you obviously have the parallel of, Finland was neutral throughout most of the 20th century, but then that policy of neutrality was completely rewritten when they joined NATO a couple of years ago, obviously following the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and that policy shift is very interesting because first of all, it changes for Sweden as well, about 150 years of neutrality on all accounts, but also Finland's military has also been put under the spotlight because Finnish kind of military doctrine and their kind of tactics is all geared towards defending an attack from Russia, because that's what they've been expecting and that's what they've been preparing for. So the whole notion of kind of, obviously the parallel between World War II and today, or even Tsarist Russia and today, is that kind of intent of wanting to re-establish spheres of influence or sort of regain control, even if it's via puppet governments of former territories that maybe the Soviet Union held.
Well, and also there's that sense, isn't there, that some people say, it's a mistake to think of Putin as wanting to re-establish the Soviet sphere of influence. He is going full Peter the Great. He's going all the way back to.
It's almost like an amalgamation of both eras, almost, in the way that they were work. But obviously, the main kind of talking point from the Russian side is that they want to minimize the direct border with NATO and halt NATO expansion.
And again, this takes us back to the 19th century, Russia versus Sweden, Finland being this funny kind of.
Which is also then the irony then comes out of, well, they were trying to shorten the NATO border, but then they've inadvertently freaked out Sweden and Finland enough to then join NATO, creating another couple thousand miles of direct border with NATO.
Total counterintuitive.
Which is more strategic in a lot of ways, because a lot of Russia's nuclear aviation capacity is in the kind of Murmansk northern region of Russia, which is not that far away from Finland. And there's not very many sort of kind of like infrastructure development in that region. It's kind of like a couple of railways or whatever. But you would sort of think like strategically that's a silly thing to have done. And we can obviously dive more into NATO and the geopolitics of
I think the early history of NATO might be an interesting topic for another day, and the extent to which Russia is kind of frozen out of that to an extent. Although, as you were telling me before, it's largely because of Russian actions that Russia is frozen out of NATO.
Well, yeah, it's kind of like why are you afraid of us? Well, maybe keep on invading us.
And that's kind of the seed. I mean, it goes back a lot further. Obviously.
There's a lot of nuance.
But you've got this St. Petersburg, Moscow kind of. Are we in Europe? Are we in Asia? Kind of thing. That goes back for hundreds of years. But this moment in NATO is very much that kind of seed that we now see flowering in the most awful way of that kind of paranoia, that paranoid mindset that Russia has long had.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, I mean, I think that's like obviously as condensed of a history as we can kind of fit into one podcast episode. But I think that the main thing to kind of take from this is that we look at obviously the Axis and the Allies, and we look at it as a fight between two distinct ideologies or worldviews. But actually, when we look at World War II, the Soviets allied with the Allies because it was convenient to their cause. There was almost like uncomfortable agreements between the two to sort of be like reluctantly we'll work together.
Well, and as soon as their mutual foe is out of the picture, they're straight at each other's throats, and that's the Cold War.
I mean, and with we look at the two factions, but actually you had the Allies, the Axis, and then the Comintern. Those are the three factions that were there. All had their own interests, their own goals and ambitions. But it's when we look at some more of these, like, I mean, obviously we'll dive into topics you're going to cover in the next couple episodes. But it's never as black and white as being aligned with one country. Finland was a very unique example. And everything they did throughout between World War One ending and the kind of like the concession of territory in 1944 was down to self-preservation. It was down to opportunism as well. We're not going to pretend that they didn't have ambition of their own to take more territory and expand. But it was all sort of from a self-interest perspective. They didn't sort of agree with Nazi policy on kind of like the Holocaust or things like that, and they resisted those things too. And I think that's where it's not as clear as people sometimes think it is. But I always think it's an incredible example. I always it's fascinating learning about.
Oh yeah, always. Well, I've really enjoyed hearing about it. I had absolutely no idea about any of this, so I'm thoroughly fascinated.
That's what we're all about here.
I'm glad you went down the rabbit hole for me on that. And